Hello and good afternoon. My name is Kit Cabello of Hard Lens Media. Hard Lens Media is heard every Saturday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time on Q4 Radio. You can listen to us on 1680 a.m. or you can go online to www.quuv4.org. We also have this wonderful mini-series on CanTV, Channel 21. So if you're tuning in, you've been seeing us interview a lot of activists, grassroots leaders, political candidates, as well as current incumbents. But this is a very special interview that we're conducting here today at the Q4 radio station. And that's with one of our fellow team members who has finally returned back after a long international trip. His name is Paul DuPont. You might have heard him in some of our earlier podcasts. And if you check us out on our YouTube page, as well as our Facebook page, as well as our other social media links, Paul DuPont has done a few interviews and has commented with us when we were filming on location, so please check those out. But let me just do this introduction. Paul, thank you so much for returning back to us.
Thanks for having me back.
We're glad that you are back. So basically, you were on an international trip to Kenya and Greece. Mm-hmm. So I think for a lot of our viewers, first, give us a short introduction to who you are, how you joined Hard Lens Media, and basically the purpose of your trip to Kenya. So let's cover Kenya first. And well, first we got to do the introduction to who you are.
I'm Paul DuPont. Helped start up Hard Lens Media, and I really, in just the last few years, I've become more and more politically engaged and felt the need to dig deep, ask deep questions, and share my own political thoughts and political ideology with other people. And it was nice to find, sort of common ground with folks that also wanted to start getting the word out on candidates and issues. And so Hard Lens Media has been a really great outlet for sort of talking through and reasoning through really difficult political ideas, but also looking at, the current state of actions in the state of Illinois and federally and internationally, and just sort of really bringing an independent voice to Chicago and talking really thoughtfully about politics in general.
We're glad to have you on board. You've really helped us out building our team up. But of course, you did have to go overseas. So essentially, why were you in Kenya? And let's just hear about some of your experiences over there.
We'll start with Kenya.
Yeah, so let's start that.
So I've always had a real big heart for international and foreign policy and really understanding America's place in the world, because I think there's a big gap in Americans' understanding of our actions internationally. And so I began planning this trip, and in conjunction with what I wanted to do in Greece, my parents work in the mission field in Kenya. They've started their own nonprofit, and in conjunction with my travels, they wanted me to come and help them produce some short videos to support their nonprofit organization, which is called Friends of Asilong. So I spent 6 weeks in Kenya in that capacity, helping them document some of the work that they're doing with this small community. And along the way, I was able to really observe a lot of the politics in Kenya, how that works, and really difficult societal differences between American culture and Kenyan culture, and sort of be able to think about that apart from the actual work of promoting the nonprofit. The nonprofit itself is sort of multifaceted. They're really pouring themselves into this community in a number of different ways. There's a church that they've been instrumental in starting. There's a pastor that pastors that church that is not from the area but does speak the local language. There's a primary school that had already started when they got there, that they have really come alongside and helped get really good test results for the kids, and really sort of change community perceptions about schooling, because traditionally they did not want to send their children to school in the area a lot. They've started a secondary school, so there's now a high school for kids to continue on, rather than having to graduate from the primary school and then go to another village for secondary schooling, or for a lot of kids just discontinue their schooling altogether. A lot of the impetus came when, before the nonprofit was started and got going, there were wells that were put in the region about 15 years ago or so. And it had come to a point, these mechanical wells, the hand pump wells don't have a substantial lifespan. They break down. So early on, a lot of the work was getting materials to repair the wells and training local people to be able to do that, how to get supplies, how to do the work in pulling up the risers, repairing the pump mechanisms and things like that. And it's really cool to now see their team of about 5 individuals in the community that specialize in well repair, and are able to go to these 10 or 11 wells in the region and have that group, that municipality, as it were, or that small community come together and pay for the supplies to allow this team to go in and repair that well. And water is such an important resource in community building. As I was saying on the radio show earlier, you look at this area, this greater community of the Pecot tribe. 25 years ago, they were a nomadic people, right? They were constantly warring with their neighboring tribes. A lot of it was governments were giving weapons to people to, try to clear out area, and it just was a lot of back and forth violence until about 20 years ago, when the government came in and took the guns away from the people to prevent them from warring with each other. And then wells started to go in from a number of different organizations, and that allowed people to no longer be constantly nomadic, looking for sources of water and never wanting to set up housing permanently anywhere, both because they had to constantly be looking for water and they were under constant threat of attack. Now you have a situation where people can make more permanent structures and can, herd cattle in a more sustainable way, and can have agriculture in a way that is feeding their local community. And even of the 2 trips that I've taken, I took a trip there 5 years ago, it's growing by leaps and bounds. Infrastructure in the area is going up. Obviously, because of the schools, people are becoming more educated. Attitudes are changing. Some of the traditional cultural attitudes toward marriage, it's a very polygamous culture. Even though female circumcision or female genital mutilation is outlawed in Kenya, it was still a widespread practice that is dwindling quickly. As education comes up, now you actually have children saying, this custom that we have is not good. It's wrong. We shouldn't do it. And so that's changing quickly, and it's really kind of a marvel to see this community come into its own. And the goals of the program really are to make this community self-sustaining and able to work off of a foundation to foster well-being amongst their community. And it's amazing to see that happen.
Now, of course, you haven't been back there in 5 years, so I'm pretty sure 5 years, a lot can happen. But from what you're saying is that during that 5-year absence, when you return, there has been a big shift towards people embracing more, having more of a stable lifestyle, basically staying in one spot, no longer being nomadic, sending their kids off to school, and thriving off of a growing infrastructure and having access to fresh, clean water. My question is, though, is there any pushback or any people who still want to hold on to their traditional culture and cultural identity? Has there been any kind of remnants of that?
Absolutely.
Or are they slowly disappearing?
I think the opposition toward things like the church coming in and things like educating their children, there was more pushback to that 5 years ago than there is now. There is still pushback in the community. A lot of people still don't want to educate their children. I mean, but 5 years ago, it was very different. People would say, fine, if you want to educate the children, they're no longer my children, they're your children. Oh. It's like, well, okay, they're still your children, man. One of the things, when you see this rapid of a change in a community, things that are slow to change can cause new challenges. So you're coming from a situation where there's a very high infant mortality rate. It's a very polygamist type culture. One man would have many wives, and generally in that sort of situation, you're trying to have as many children as possible because a lot of them are going to die, and you need to have a next generation to help care for cattle. You need to. And girls are seen as a prize because you can sell them for bride price. It's still, their dowry is still a big thing in their culture. But as you see infant mortality drop, now you're seeing a huge population boom. Right. And so that is changing perceptions of how they're going to operate moving forward. And as you have people being convinced that having multiple wives is maybe not a good thing, that is drastically changing sort of the cultural outlook and the cultural makeup of the community. Now, this is still only over the last 10 years or so where the major changes has been happening. So you have the older generation that can very clearly articulate what things used to be like because they lived it, but there's this massive sea change in lifestyle, education levels, population levels, quality of life, that the few people that are still holdovers of like, I don't want to send my children to school, I do want to have multiple wives, all of this, we want to be able to, what if we get attacked by the Turkana again, we want to be able to war with them. That mindset is fading away into the background a good bit. You still see kids that are not in school. Right. Despite the fact that the Kenyan government requires that everyone go to school and requires that education be freely available to everyone, one of the things that you have just structurally is there aren't schools in every location, so schools tend to be boarding schools. And the Kenyan government does not provide enough food or salary for teachers that a lot of schools, including the one in this area, want to have an additional teacher. They want to be able to get more textbooks for students. They want to be able to feed their students, and they're put in the situation of having to have dormitories to house students that aren't local. So there ends up being tuition anyway. Schools almost across the board in Kenya have tuition, and that's a huge hurdle for a community that doesn't really participate in a marketplace and have financial wealth in a way, that they can pay the whatever $200 to $500 per year to send a child to school. When your primary economy is, we have goats and we herd them and we eat them, money doesn't often come into that unless you're going and selling them at market. Right. Which is, a huge barrier toward educating people. So at the current stage, particularly for the secondary school, there are a lot of sponsored students. Right. So there's a lot of people donating, mostly through Friends of Asiwang and some of the other churches that are involved, that are sponsoring students and paying their tuition for them. So I think something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the students in the school are being sponsored by someone else. So the hope is that you can bring the community to a place where they can collectively agree that they want their children to be educated and be participating in the greater region's markets to a point where they can't afford to send their children to school, to make that school self-sustaining.
Now, I think for a lot of our audience members, especially if you listen to us on Q4 Radio, you did mention on the program earlier today that if a school is very successful, if it's set up by one of the nonprofits, the government of Kenya will come in and claim ownership of it. Yeah. Can you explain to our viewers on CanTV exactly what that means and why does that happen?
Well, it happens primarily because there's a lot of upfront cost in starting a school, and there's no guarantee that it's going to work well. And so it's not something that government funds in Kenya go toward readily. But when there is pre-existing success, there really is no barrier for the government coming in and just claiming ownership over a school and saying, this is now a public school, look at the great work that we did, even though we didn't really do it. And so that's something that, if you're going in there with the goal of trying to raise the standard of living of a community and really come alongside and foster a really good foundation for a community to be self-sustaining and increase their quality of life and well-being in their area, you have to be kind of okay with the fact that when you see success in some of your endeavors, they're going to be eaten up by the government. That's not to say that they're then failures, it just means that you lose control over it. Okay. So that's something that people that are working on these schools are very, very well aware of, that will eventually happen. If they succeed in making a school that churns out educated kids that are ending up going to college and ending up pouring back into their own community, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, the government's going to take ownership of that school, but what comes along with that is now the local government and their state or their province, their governor, will now spend more infrastructure in that area. And that's one of the things that people talked about this trip. The government paid almost no attention to this area. I remember 10 years ago, the first trip that my parents took there, there's a final military checkpoint because it's right on the border with Uganda. It's about 5 to 7 miles from the border with Uganda where this last military checkpoint is. And the first time they went in there, the military was just like, what are you doing? Like, we're not coming in there. If there's a problem, we're not going to help you. Like, you're on your own. But now the government is going in there. They're spending money on infrastructure for cattle chutes, for
clean water, for
they put in a dam. They're working on putting in new roads. They're having much more open dialogue with their governor in this area because it's one of the areas that's seeing the most rapid rise in quality of life for its citizens. So it's really cool to sort of see that unfold.
Now you've also mentioned too on the show that there was a heavily contested election in Kenya as well, and that it's still kind of being felt even to this day. Mm-hmm. Essentially, what was that election about? Because especially on the Heartlands Media YouTube page, Facebook account, and Spreaker account, you actually did a sit-down interview with one of the local community leaders. Mm-hmm. So at least explain to us, what was that election all about?
Yeah, so I spoke to Julius Sawe, who's the church leader in Asilong, and he's not directly connected with the election in any major way, but I wanted to get his input as a local Kenyan as to how he sees it. And one of the things that became clear to me is that, first off, elections in Kenya are very tribal, right? Kenya has something like 26 or 27 sub-tribes, and there are alliances between tribes and things like that, but it's divided partially along racial lines, but it's a hard mentality to understand from an American mindset, because while we participate in a form of tribalism, it often comes down to ideological lines or socioeconomic lines. These are very literal, racially oriented tribes, and they tend to vote in a particular way. So you've got one, I believe it's I'm going to mess it. It's not the Turkana. It's one of the tribes is basically in power, and they have the most one of the more affluent tribes, and they have a lot of good alliances with other tribes, and they're sort of the established power. Not to say that they aren't doing good things in Kenya. They've really helped raise education standards across the country. That's been one of their big political platforms. But Kenya is under a new constitution. They gained independence in the late 60s, but their constitution was just rewritten a few years ago. And so there's a lot of confusion over the exact process by which they elect their new president. And in the election that was held, there was found to be basically rules broken and impropriety in the election system, and their court system called for a re-election, basically a do-over. So Uhuru Kenyatta is the incumbent. He won the election that they said that they had to redo. And the opposition party leader is a guy named Raila Odinga, and it's a conglomeration of many different parties, and it smacked to me as a lot of the kind of election trouble that you see even here in the West. We talk about the primary between Bernie and Hillary being rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton in a number of ways. That's the accusation that the opposition party was making against Kenyatta. You were supposed to have polls were supposed to be staffed by people who could apply from anywhere. Anyone should be allowed to apply to be a pollster, but it was completely staffed by people who were favorable to the incumbent party. There was supposed to be fair coverage in newspapers about such, and that didn't happen. There were a lot of rules that were broken, and even in the re-election, it was obvious that those rules were broken. And so there was a little bit of there was a moment where they said, well, we still shouldn't declare a winner because there isn't a clear winner. And then the incumbent party went ahead and swore themselves in as the winner anyway. And then even the opposition party swore themselves in as the leader anyway. But in practice, the incumbent party is still in power. Right. Even to this day, just last week, there was one of the opposition leaders, not Raila Odinga, but a different one, was imprisoned for instigating more riots. There's still political unrest as a result of that. And in the wake of that, the incumbent party, the controlling party in Kenyatta's government, temporarily shut down all media in the country, which the UN called for. You have to open up, you have to allow media to operate. They were down for 3 days, but that's the kind of thing that's like, man, that doesn't look good. But man, neither one of these parties, I think, is wholly trustworthy. It's like, yeah, even if this opposition party is right and there was impropriety in the election system, this guy doesn't appear to stand for much, and doesn't. It still is just like, well, our tribe is in power, not your tribe. It really seems like power grab type politics, and doesn't really have the type of populism in the way that we think of.
I know a lot of people basically want to have this ended, like they want some sort of return to normalcy as much as possible, and
that's the overriding sentiment, is that this is just disruptive.
That's universally agreed.
Yeah, the most ardent supporters of the opposition are still really upset about it, understandably so. Right. But the overwhelming sentiment is this is bad for tourism. Tourism is down. That's a huge sector of the economy. This is not good for education. It's closing colleges and universities for fear of rioting. And there's a lot of political rioting that goes on. I mean, I remember, this is not this most recent trip, but the past trip, I remember seeing a billboard advertising for political riot insurance, which is just like, man, there's an industry around insurance for political rioting. Okay, that's a thing. People want calm, people want peace. People just don't want to be dealing with politics at the moment in Kenya. And it's difficult to watch and difficult to see. Definitely there was some news breaking while I was there with regard to the re-election. But ultimately, the overwhelming sentiment is they want it to calm down. They want a return to normalcy.
I think real quick before this interview is wrapped up, I think what a lot of our viewers want to know is, what's your biggest takeaway from your experience in Kenya, and what have you learned?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is in dealing with humanitarian aid to a country that has such drastically different cultural sensibilities, the hardest thing is to work in a way that is respectful of both the culture and the direction of progress and well-being for that society, in a way that does not foster dependency, which is such a fine line. Because when you're going in there and offering help or guidance, or particularly any kind of financial support or material support, you can create a dependency. You can create a sensibility where, like, well, these are people coming in to give us stuff, so I don't need to work, I don't need to take ownership of it. This is this other person's thing, and it just happens to be helping me. And you end up with different schools of thought on that. There are long-term missionaries in Kenya that basically don't bring anything in. They don't bring anything financial in. They are just there to come alongside the community and work in that way. And that is a slow and arduous process, and you don't necessarily get a lot of local support when you do that because you're not bringing anything.
Right.
And then you have short-term mission projects that are bringing things and saying, well, we don't care if we create dependency. We're trying to do something good. And it's such a fine line between, are we really fostering and enabling growth in this community and promoting well-being without becoming a sort of, foreign benefactor, right? You're being sort of a foreign parent to this group, and that's the hardest thing to grapple with, and it's sort of, I question, where on this line is this particular humanitarian work falling? Like, how much dependency are we creating? Are we really fostering sustainable growth? That's the word that we keep using because it's the goal, but it's so hard to gauge or measure that. It's hard to even find a metric by which you can say this is truly something that is going to be sustainable. Once these foreign missionaries leave and don't come back, this community, we can be confident, will continue to support itself and continue to better itself.
And not fall backwards or regress.
And but who knows?
Has that ever happened to where like a missionary, a community helped by a missionary group, it just regresses backwards or like it loses sustainability?
Yeah, I can't think of specific examples, but as well, in one case, specifically in this area, when the wells were put in, the group that put in the wells didn't put in any effort into keeping them maintained or training people on how to repair them.
Right.
And
or
so
keeping them clean too from contaminants.
Right. So now that there's additional outside influence, we're able to try and train people in how to do that. Right. The hope is that when this group no longer can go, that group of locals that is repairing the wells will continue to do so, and there's great hope that will be the case.
And real quick, the name of the organization that you were with, where can our viewers learn more about it? Where can they find them on social media?
Yeah, the group is called Friends of Osilong. They don't have a website up yet, but they will soon. I believe it'll be friendsofosilong.com.
Okay, well, that's a very good note.
ASILONG, Osilong.
All right, well, that's a very good note to end it on. Paul, look, we're glad to have you back, part of the team. We're going to do probably a secondary follow-up interview with your experience in Greece. It's important to get that side of the story, too. You talked a lot about it on Q4 Radio, especially during the second hour. I think a lot of people would definitely get a big learning experience from your time over there. And the fact that you have that experience, especially being overseas, I think a lot of Americans don't really understand what's really happening outside our country and some of the policies that our nation puts on the international community. So it's very important to hear at least what's happening in Greece and the refugee crisis that's apparently getting out of hand over there. So it's important that we definitely do a follow-up cover through. So we're glad that you made it back safe and that you're here with us. And more importantly, to all our viewing audience, thank you for tuning in to Hard Lens Media. Your support in supporting our social media networks, such as on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, on Instagram, is a big help. If you like what we do, check us out. We're on Q4 Radio every Saturday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Peace to you, everyone.
You're watching Hard Lens Media.